Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to all to the afternoon session. I hope you are not too tired after lunch to follow my presentation. It might be a bit difficult because it deals with a difficult subject, that is fairness or justice in international negotiations. I will deal in the first part with the general principles of international fairness and justice and boil it down to two theme-specific sections about climate change and trade negotiation. Trade negotiations I will also only cover if I have enough time to go by that. So let us start with the first topic. For me it's very difficult to see, but perhaps you can decipher it. Otherwise you have to listen what I say orally. You see, fairness in international agreements matters because there is no overarching global authority to impose solutions. So you can only hope that countries will comply by voluntarily if they conceive the solution agreed as largely fair. So this aspect was for long neglected in the international relations theory, which maintained that what matters is more or less brute force, power, and material interests of the negotiation parties. So what is now difficult coming down from this general level is to conceive of principles, overarching principles for global justice and justice which could have a consensual range, and that's very difficult because to start with we have at the very beginning two conflicting principles of fairness justice. There's one position that is the internationalist school, which means that we have to differentiate between principles of international and global fairness. I come to this point in a minute. And we have the globalist view, which take each and every citizen of the world as the basic unit for distributing justice. In this view, in the international view, the nation state is taken as the central entity to reach justice among nations, not among individuals. Herein, the world is not conceived as a single undertaking governed by a single principle, but it is broken by national identities, by states who are domestically coercive undertakings responsive to the demands of their citizens, but they are not obliged to reach any kind of global justice. So the contrary view is taking every citizen of the world as having equal human rights, and so that means that the national borders do not count so very much. They maintain that the international system is strong enough at the moment to coerce nation states and to have an impact on the life chances of individuals, which is enough strong to establish a commitment and a duty for international distributive justice. The international position does not negate any kind of moral duty, but it does not move beyond kind of keeping with international norms like non-interference, avoidance of war, and whatsoever. But they are not pleading or not backing any kind of international or global distributive scheme above the level where basic rights for every citizen of the world are more or less guaranteed. That means a minimum level of international assistance for everybody. The globalists say that this is not enough, because first of all, we have you are not responsible for the country you are born into. So it's more or less by chance that you are German or Indian or whatsoever. They secondly argue that the international system is strong enough, coercive enough, and they point out to the IMF and the World Trade Organization to have a distinct impact on the life chances of people. And last but not least, they argue that the poorer countries where the rights of the people in poorer countries were violated by the restrictive international system. They point to colonialism, influence of transnational cooperation, and so forth. I will not deal extensively with the correctness of the two views. Let me only tell that I would take an intermediate position. I also think, like the internationalists, that economic development and well-being is mostly dependent on domestic institutions and domestic governance. But in addition to that, I also think that the international impact has a certain impact on the life chances. All what you can see, it's easily observable in the trade and climate domain, because it really distributes valuable goods or bads in the international domain. So, leaving that aside, the problem is that we have not only a conflict in the overarching principles of distributive justice, but we have also the problems that we have to take care of the principles, so metric principles of comparison. That is not easy, because if you distribute public goods or bads on an equal per capita basis, you run into the problem that you have to extend the past and project it in the future. You might end up with unconditional transfers and assistance. You have the problem that the aggregation of goods and bads poses a problem, and there's no institution available at the international level to do the job of aggregating. And then they have the problem that the preferences of people worldwide are not identical, that nobody in hot countries has any use for warming by wood ovens or whatsoever. So the needs are also different. The preferences and needs are different. So therefore, coming to an end with this paragraph, it's first of all there's a heavy conflict between two strands of equity or distributional discourse, and then you have the problem of aggregating values in different fields, and you have the problem that this is even more difficult and complicated. So I will narrow it down now to the level of individual negotiations. It's not easier, you will you see in a moment, and start with the climate negotiations, which is my favorite topic in the last few years. Climate change negotiation has several features that makes it an extremely difficult challenge for global governance. Large cuts of greenhouse gas emissions are called for by a multitude of actors if global warming shall be contained, requiring radical changes in energy and environmental politics. Secondly, very long time lags exist between mitigation actions and their impact on global warming. And last but not least, climate is a conflicting claims problem by nature. as not enough carbon space is left for every nation. Let me explain. 2/3 of the global carbon space have already been used, and with the current growth of emissions, the internationally agreed goal of containing climate change cannot be met. A larger effort than before was made with the announcement of the INDCs during the Paris conference, but even these commitments are not sufficient to keep global warming below or at 2 degrees centigrades. So larger efforts are necessary by most partners. Accordingly, a harsh conflict over fairness norms in the distribution of the remaining budget has always accompanied negotiations of the conference of the parties. Common but differentiated responsibilities was for long the mantra of emerging economies, in principle India and China. But it offers no solution for containing global warming as future emissions until 2030 or so, and as future emissions of China and India will absorb around 40% of the remaining global carbon space, leaving no room for emissions for anybody else. So and in a sense, this principle of differentiated but common responsibilities boils down to the fact that there's a group of countries where you need not expect anything, while the rest is done by the more advanced economies. This is certainly not a sustainable position because, as I already mentioned, the carbon space is more or less used up to a certain degree, and it needs stricter policies from everybody, more or less. So this was more or less accepted in the Paris conference, where the top-down approach, that means establishing a limit for the global community and dividing it by the nations participating in the conferences, was given up for a bottom-up approach. Every country was asked to announce its intended national mitigation commitments, and they were then added up without further ado. It was agreed that 5 years after there will be a review and of the commitments and the implementation undertaken. So this has completely changed. Let me nevertheless deal with some principles which were mostly advanced by India and China during the negotiations of the climate deals. They centered principally on the polluters pay principle and the historic responsibilities of developed countries for the majority of emissions. There are nevertheless a lot of problems with these principles, which are intuitively appealing and simple, which make them more or less unfit in terms of satisfying the requirements of international fairness. The equal per capita attribution is not a holistic proposal because it picks up only mitigation efforts and not adaptation costs, nor the benefits of transfer of climate-related technologies and financial assistance through international funds established during the negotiation on the climate treaty, most prominently the Green Climate Fund. One could also deny that access to emission rights is of the same quality as core human rights are, like the right to food or medical care. It is only derivative of these basic human rights. equality of life chances do also not require that each person should have the same access to each resource in the same way, because, as I already mentioned, needs and preferences differ between countries. So it's it's not easy to establish a common benchmark for equalizing the access to this good. Sharing the carbon space on a per capita basis poses another lot of problems. How shall we take into consideration the countervailing influence of carbon sinks or changing land use patterns, for example, in Brazil, deforestation or afforestation? Second, the desired production of goods and services might also be achieved by lower energy intensity or by switching to renewable energy. So the per capita principle more or less fixes the status quo and discourages innovation in energy-saving technologies. Taking into consideration historic emissions is even more controversial. It means holding responsible people who have long left the scene. It means making responsible states who have also left the scene because they have merged with other countries, they have split up or whatsoever, because they have changed the regime. So fixing responsibility for past emissions is very difficult, and the most important point, nobody did know before 1980 or so that it is really harmful to emit such a lot of atmospheric particles into the air. So concerning these difficulties, another variant was proposed. That means the capacity to pay, or the equal sacrifice. That was proposed mostly by the developed countries, and means that every country should take the same effort in future in terms of economic growth lost, or in terms of sacrifice of nations in question. That is even more difficult because you cannot calculate exactly the amount necessary for mitigation, adaptation, and transfer technology. So it's mere guesswork. It was advanced by the developed states because they would fare better with this proposal than with any other principle. So, and that brings me to the last point, and unfortunately I cannot cover the trade aspect of negotiation. That brings me to the last point. It is really striking that every country advances the principle in climate negotiation most appropriate for its own interest. So India is operating with a scheme which allows the country to emit even more. It's only giving an indication that its energy intensity of growth will be reduced, and it's not indicating any cap of the total emissions. China is operating on a similar scale, but is indicating that it will put a cap on total emissions in 2030. Developed countries naturally argue with the grandfathering clause that emissions until 1985 should not be considered, and the rest should be distributing according to capacity to pay. So you see, there's a kind of gap between the philosophical principles advanced and what is arriving at the sport. We have, we end up with the same self-serving principles put into practice, and which contradict what I said at the beginning. So I'm really wondering if ever we can agree on some kind of principles for sharing public goods or global public goods and public bets, and I doubt that team-specific negotiations are the right place to do that. Perhaps we should have some other undertaking, assistance to poorer countries, to burdened societies, but not by a theme-specific proposal which mixes up efficiency aims and distributional aims, but better with a more general undertaking at the international scene, perhaps within the United Nations. Thank you.